Hey, everybody, welcome back to another installment of the NTC podcast. This is Aaron Washington coming back to you guys for another episode. This is going to be our 132nd installment, and we're going to get into a little bit of news and trends for the Philadelphia 76ers this time around to help me kind of break down the status of the Sixers and everything that's been going on with the team, because it is a lot. There has been a lot of drama. Adam Aaronson is on with me this afternoon to help break down the situation. For you guys that are unaware, he's a Sixers beat writer with the Philly Voice. So obviously he's pretty tapped in. He follows the team all season long, and figured he'd be the perfect guy to talk to kind of help discuss what's been going on with the team this season and where they might be going here in the near future. So Adam, I just want to say thanks again for joining the pod. It's great to have you on. I love the work that you do for the Philly Voice, covering the Sixers. And just really excited to talk Sixers with you this afternoon and kind of dive into everything that's been going on with the team this season.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Anytime, man. So we're going to get into a few different topics here with the Sixers. I figure let's start with the elephant in the room when it comes to this team. It's their best player. This is a league MVP. This is an all-NBA first team type of guy when he's healthy. Unfortunately, that's not really the case right now for him due to injuries primarily. We're going to get into Joel Embiid and discussing exactly what his season has been like to this point and kind of what's been going on with him. So I just want to point out a few things here when it comes to Embiid, some of the overarching numbers of his season so far. He's never played more than 68 games in a season, and it looks like this season is going to be more of the same for him, unfortunately. He's only played 19 out of the 58 games that Sixers have played to this point in the season. His two-point percentage is down about 6 percentage points from last year. Same for his three-point percentage, is down almost 10%. He's sitting at just under 30% on the season so far from deep. Points per game is his lowest since his fourth season in the league. He's at about 23.8 right now. So definitely a little bit lower than we've expected from him in the recent seasons. So obviously, Adam, this hasn't been the best season for Embiid. He's been in and out of the lineup. Currently, he is consulting with the team and a medical specialist to help determine what the best course of action is going forward. So I really just want to start the conversation here when it comes to Embiid's health and what's been going on with him. So I just want to ask you what you've heard most recently about Embiid's status. Do you expect him to come back this season to play more games? And just kind of what are some of your general thoughts about what he's brought to this team here through about 58 games?
Yeah, so Nick Nurse said before the Sixers played the Knicks at Madison Square Garden yesterday that he expects there to be an update on Joel Embiid in the next couple days. We're recording this on Thursday evening. I would be surprised if we didn't have something by their practice early Friday afternoon. And frankly, I am not expecting him to play again this season. That is not based on anything I've been sort of told specifically or definitively. It's just my sense of the situation and watching him move. I mean, you read all the stats. The stats are down across the board. And when you watch him play, it's not hard to see why. He just can't move with the same ability that he used to. It limits him on the glass. The Sixers have been pummeled on the offensive glass whenever he's in the game all season. It limits him defensively. He can't really stick with anybody, as far as lateral quickness. And just the matter of the fact is he doesn't have enough trust in his knee to do a lot of the things that made him special. This is a guy who 13 months ago was averaging 35, 12, 6, and 2, and was the favorite to win his second MVP in a row. And now we're talking about whether he can even play at all. He just has not been able to stay consistently available, even for his own standards. As you mentioned, he's never been an 82-game player in the regular season, but he did have a good stretch of, 60 to 65 roughly, pretty much year in and year out, where you knew there would be a few sort of lengthy absences, and here and there he would get a night off for rest. But generally speaking, he was available in the regular season. The issue was something always happened in the playoffs, whether that was with his knee or last year he gets Bell's palsy while also dealing with a knee injury. So he just, going into the season, everyone said the regular season, it doesn't matter how much he plays as long as he's ready for April, May, June. But they're not going to get to April, May, June if they don't have enough of him and they don't have Embiid at the level that he's been known to play at. They're not going to get there. And right now they're even in the Eastern Conference when the Chicago Bulls are trying to hand everybody else the 10 seed for the play-in spot. The
Mhm.
Sixers simply have refused to take it from them, and then the Bulls came to Philly the other night and beat them by 30 plus in a game that at one point they were winning by 52,
Yeah.
uh, with an offense that has been hard since they traded Zach LaVine, and they were without Nikola Vucevic in that game. And that
Right.
was the Sixers' 8th loss in a row, and that streak is now at 9. I just don't think that you can really justify risking any further injury to Embiid, any more wear and tear on that knee in a season where, again, they're 20 and 38. Even when he has played of late, he hasn't been good enough. The team hasn't been good enough. The Sixers were sort of leading into the trade deadline talking about, still it's a very small sample size, but when Joel and Tyrese Maxey and Paul George all play together, we look great. And that was true to an extent. They did. Their record when those guys started and finished games, I think, was 6-1 or 7-1 at the time. Since then, they lost to the Detroit Pistons without Cade Cunningham in a game where they were down by 30 in the first half. They got smoked by the Bucks without Giannis Antetokounmpo. They've had bad loss after bad loss, culminating with losing to a Brooklyn Nets team that might be trying harder than anyone right now to tank, and Jordi Fernandez just will not let them. And their defense has been marvelous. And when you're almost fully healthy and you lose to a team that's starting Killian Hayes at point guard in his second game with the team on a 10-day contract, it's probably a sign of where things are going. And then they have that Chicago loss that was just unspeakably bad. I just think that the circumstances surrounding the Sixers season are too disastrous to really justify playing a hobbled version of Embiid, who is clearly far from himself, and risk that something happens that gives him even more, trouble moving into next year and years beyond, because he has another year on his deal after this one, and then after that, a 3-year supermax contract extension that he signed kicks in. So
Mhm.
after this season, he's on the books for another 4 years and $250 million, roughly.
Yep.
So they, as much as the window is supposed to be now, and you never know with Embiid when the window closes, and Paul George is going to be 35 in May. As much as you would like to push the chips in now, they do have a future to think about with Embiid and even with George and others.
Exactly. Yeah, all great points there, Adam. It's really unfortunate how this has gone down for Embiid. Because, like you said, I mean, he has recently been one of the best players in the NBA. And I just remember watching him just be so dominant. And even though he is like one of the strongest players in the league and he uses his size to great advantage, he's also, when he's at his best, he's actually pretty nimble for his size. It's something I've noticed. Really light on his feet, gets to his spots on the floor pretty easily. He can get by some guys that are similar to his size in a face-up situation. And he just can't really do that, like you said. He's very limited. So, yeah, it just really just makes sense right now to shut him down, move forward to next season, because if you do him more damage this season, I mean, next season doesn't even really matter. And then, like you said, I mean, they're so far gone already, 20 and 38, losing to the Bulls that one night. I had to double check the score to make sure I was looking at that
Yeah.
correctly. I think it was 86 to 136, and I was like just mind blown that was the current situation. So, yeah, all signs indicate that this is a lost season for the Sixers. And I mean, on the bright side, last night was a little bit more encouraging for this team, at least coming off of a game like the Chicago performance. They only lost by 5 to the New York Knicks in New York. And Paul George looked a little bit better there. Kelly Oubre chipped in as well. Maxey had 30 points. But it's tough when you are a team that is so far behind. I think they're 2.5 games behind Chicago at this present moment. 23rd in offensive rating, 26th in defense. I mean, they're bottom third in pretty much every statistic. So, yeah, I think it's about time to look forward to the future when it comes to this team and Embiid. And then, yeah, that 179 million over the next 3 years is pretty crazy. And then he has that player option in 28, 29. And I'm going to bring up our cap sheet here in a few minutes to take a look at some of these contracts and to put it in perspective. But it really is pretty crazy. But I think one last question I have for you, Adam, when it comes to Embiid is the activity that he took part in before the season started, which was the Summer Olympics, in which they got a gold medal. And he played in those Olympics. And even in that scenario, there were games to where he didn't quite look himself. I would say he looked better than he does right now. But do you think that that has any bearing on how he looks this season and some of the injuries he's had to deal with right now?
So I understand why there are a lot of people, particularly in the Philly area, that are certain that that's the case. I'm not certain, just because again it wasn't an enormous number of games, and he was playing about 16 minutes a game and not handling any, like a workload anything close to what he handles in an NBA game. So I don't know. Embiid and the Sixers have maintained and still maintain that it had no effect on the status of his knee right now. I understand why people would sort of be naturally inclined to think that that's not true, but you're right, and he didn't always look at his best in the Olympics. Really, the only game where he looked like Embiid was ironically sort of the one game that they needed him for, which was the Serbia game, and he helped them make that comeback. So I don't know if it actually had any sort of material impact on the status of his knee going into the season. I can certainly say that the Sixers claim it hasn't. And I'm not only am I not a doctor, but I'm also not his doctor. But I do understand why someone would look at the season he had, where the last day of January he tears his meniscus in Golden State. A few days later, he gets a surgery at the beginning of February, comes back about 2 months later at the beginning of April for the last stretch of regular season games before the playoffs. One of those regular season games seems to have a little bit of a flare up with that knee that cost him a game or two. In game one of their playoff series against the Knicks, everyone I think now remembers, he throws himself the alley oop off the glass, throws down a crazy dunk, but he hurts his knee in the process. He does that in the middle of the second quarter of that game, and at halftime, he was nowhere to be found until there were about 15 seconds left on the clock before the third quarter started. And he came out, he just jogged out like nothing had ever happened and played through it for the rest of that series. But even when he had a 50-point game in game three against the Knicks, that whole series, he was clearly hobbled. He was not moving right. He was really laboring. It was very noticeable. And I think it's become clear that he was not even in the ballpark of 100% or anywhere close to that during that series. So I do think it's fair to question, if that was the case in April, why was he playing in the Olympics? That's something that a lot of people have said. I'm never going to fault someone for wanting to play in the Olympics, particularly on this year's Team USA. He's not going to have another chance to play with the LeBrons and the Stephs and the KDs, and he absolutely earned the right to make that decision for himself. The Sixers publicly and at least to my knowledge privately were supportive of it, have maintained that they're supportive of it, and that they're still glad that he did it, and that it hasn't had any impact on what his knee is like right now. But again, as I said before, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why someone might not believe that. And I just don't have the medical degree to call it myself. But I think in any case, they claim that it wasn't impactful at all. I would believe it at least wasn't significant because, again, these were not nearly as high intensity for him specifically as like an NBA game would be with the role he has with the Sixers. And again, these were 16 minutes a game roughly for 10-ish games. It's just not a significant enough minutes load that I'm convinced something happened, particularly when there was no noticeable injury that took place during any of those games.
Yeah, great point there. Yeah, low load for him in those Olympic games. So yeah, pretty unlikely. I would agree with that. But who knows? Maybe a medical professional would have more input on that. But yeah, overall, I think that it's more of like an isolated incident here. And I mean, it's a trend for Embiid. It's not like we haven't seen this before. So I mean, this could have been the case in any other season that there wasn't Olympics involved. So no, I'm with you
Yep.
on that for sure. Unfortunately, the injuries haven't stopped there for the Sixers. They've also extended to another one of their primary players, which is Paul George. He's been dealing with an injury of his own. He confirmed just almost a week ago that he's gotten injections to play through pain due to a finger injury. I don't know exactly when that happened, when that occurred, but it seems like it's something he's been playing through for a little bit now. And it looks like it's affecting his play, at least in some form or fashion. He has similar drops across the board as Embiid when it comes to true shooting percentage, down 7% over last season. lowest points per game since 2014-15. He's at a very low number. He's under 20 points per game right now, which for Paul George is definitely subpar. He's only shooting 28% from the quarter on threes, which is very subpar for him. And in the short mid range, another number that's pretty lacking for him, about 36%, 10 to 12% lower than the last couple of seasons based on that area of the floor for Paul George. So overall, he has had some rough games this season. He hasn't quite looked like himself. I will say that one silver lining here when it comes to Paul George is defensively, he's still pretty active in those passing lanes. He's averaging about 1.8 steals per game right now, and he had multiple steals in last night's game against the Knicks. So he is still an impactful player on that end of the floor. That's something we've come to expect from Paul George over the last several seasons, really his entire career. It's just unfortunate that his percentages haven't held up on the offensive side, and he's been very inconsistent up and down when it comes to what the team can expect from him from a scoring perspective, offensively, specifically when it comes to that three-point shooting. So that has also contributed to the Sixers' reduced level of play this season. And it's where I want to kind of turn our conversation here, Adam. It is really just Paul George. They signed him to a massive deal this past summer. And you look at that at the time, and it makes sense for a team that seemed to be kind of on the verge of contention, bringing him in, replacing Tobias Harris. Looked like a great deal. At now, it's been definitely a little bit more of a question mark there. So I think I know the answer to this, but I want to ask you, do you think it was still worth the investment on Paul George, breaking him in on such a massive contract over 4 seasons? And do you feel like this level of play for him is more of an isolated incident that is being brought about by his injury issue to his finger or maybe whatever else he might be dealing with right now?
Yeah, so the finger injury happened, I would say roughly a month ago. They were playing in Chicago. He hurt, I believe it's the extensor tendon in his left pinky. And you first hear that, and you go, okay, so he hurt a tendon in his pinky on his non-shooting hand. That can't be that big of a deal. But
Mm-hmm.
he needs it in a splint, and it's completely immobilized. So he is like largely playing basketball with 9 fingers right now,
Mm-hmm.
which is obviously not an easy thing to do. Paul George is someone who he mentioned this last night. He likes to go left as a driver. He now can't really go left. Teams know he can't go left, and they're starting to sit on his right hand more. That's definitely played a part in these recent struggles. There was a game that they lost in Brooklyn where Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey both were ruled out. And you say, okay, this is Paul George's time to shine. This is where he takes over. Scored 2 points. And it was just because you can't, it's really hard to be comfortable shooting. It's hard to be comfortable dribbling. It's even hard to be comfortable passing the ball or catching the ball, which are sort of the most basic functions that you can do. And he's starting to get more comfortable with that. He was much better in the second half against the Knicks last night. He really got going in a way that he hasn't in a long time. He went, I believe, over a month without scoring 20 plus points in a game, which is sort of unbelievable for a guy that averaged over 20 points a game for over a decade going into this year, where now he's more like 16 and a half. So that has plagued him recently. But before this happened, he was still having an extremely disappointing season. And to me, the part that sticks out that is the most concerning is the burst or lack thereof. He's just really struggling to get downhill and get by people. And he's always been more of a pull up shooting guy than like, he's not like Giannis barreling towards the rim, for example.
Right.
But you have to have a certain amount of that to then leverage the pull up shooting ability. Like
Exactly.
the pull up shots are tougher if the defenders know they're coming and they're not really, sitting on a drive.
Right.
So that's been the biggest issue. And I do at phillyvoice.com, I do a mailbag every week and on Tuesdays. And this week, somebody's just asked, how cooked is Paul George? And he's definitely not cooked as a player. Like, as you mentioned, the defense has been excellent,
Oh yeah.
way better than I expected. And actually, I would say just about every part of his game has been better than I thought it would be, other than the shooting and scoring, which
Right.
have been so far below his typical standards that he looks like somewhat of a shell of himself. And when you just look at the numbers of like his shot profile, the average shot he takes is a foot farther away from the basket with the Sixers than it was during his 5 years with the Clippers. Uh, it's about 1 in 10 shots that he's taking coming within 3 feet of the rim, which is just, and he's not someone that's usually taking 50% of his shots within 3 feet of the rim, but that's a pretty staggeringly low number. And it's not really compatible with like a quote unquote star, just based on the usage that those players have to have offensively. So I'm not worried about George not being a good, helpful, useful player for the Sixers. But when you sign someone to a 4-year max, let alone with 10 plus years of service, so it's the biggest, of the maxes they could sign an external free agent to, 4 years, 212 with a player option. That's a guy that you're banking on to give you star level production night in and night out. And he just doesn't bring it more than once every handful of games right now. And the fact that and this is not just sort of a numbers thing. This is something that was how I felt watching every minute of every Sixers game. And then you go to the shooting, frequencies and you see that it sort of lines up. He just doesn't have the same burst that he used to have. And frankly, that's part of the risk that you take when you sign a 34-year-old he's gonna be 35, I believe, in May. I said earlier. So that's just part of the risk that they took. And I wrote about those risks at the time. I think I was more cognizant of some of the downsides of signing George than others. And I still, like, if you had asked me at that time, would you rather sign him or not? I would have said I would rather sign him, just because he is one of the better players of this era. He's a 9-time All-Star. Up until this year, he was a lock for 21, 22 points per game plus, and is a guy that stylistically, it's not hard to see what makes him such a perfect fit with Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, both like skill set wise and even just positionally. And so I understand why they did it. I probably would have done it myself, though I think I had maybe more concerns about it than they might have. There's no doubt he's still a good player. Nobody would dispute that watching the Sixers play. But after 5 years of everyone saying the same thing about Tobias Harris, of they're paying this guy like he's a star and he's just a useful player, it's just remarkable that it looks like that might be the next 4 years with Paul George, who, by the way, has been better here than Tobias Harris was here. And Tobias has been playing great in Detroit. And that team has just been awesome to watch recently. And
Yep.
I could do a whole other podcast about enjoying the Pistons and the guys on that team, but
For sure.
But he's good. I can't stress this enough, because I think people, when they hear, when someone asks how cooked is Paul George, or, is Paul George washed, or is Paul George on the worst contract in the league? All of those are fair questions. And I think it's if I was in charge of the Sixers and I could press a magic button that takes that contract off their cap sheet, I would. He is still good and can help a team win. It's just that you now have to sort of recalibrate what his role would be on like the optimal Sixers built around George and Embiid and Maxey, and like what his offensive role is. Because I think going into the season, people imagined George and Maxey as a sort of perfect 2A, 2B. Either one could be your second guy, depending on the night, depending on the matchup. If Embiid is out, they're both overqualified second options and can make that work as the 1 and 2. But George is just not there anymore, at least from everything that we've seen this season. And unless they're serious signs of newfound off the dribble juice that I don't expect to see over the next 7 weeks, I think this summer the Sixers have to sort of reimagine. And that's not just on the front office, that's on whoever their coaching staff is how we incorporate him into our offense in a way where we can utilize his strengths, but not be too reliant on him to be a go-to scorer, because he's just showing right now that he doesn't sort of have that same juice as a one-on-one guy that he used to.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because, like you said, we've seen him be extremely good in past seasons. But yeah, I mean, the Sixers took a risk here, so there was always the possibility it can kind of theoretically blow up in their face. Looking at the numbers here for the next 3 years, I mean, 49, 51, and 54 million. It's really tough because, like, I agree, he is still a very good player, but you don't pay a guy $50+ million to be a good player. You like you said, you pay them to be a guy that can carry you certain nights and be your best player and be one of the best players in the league. At least for right now, that's not the case for him. So that's one of the reasons why the Sixers have been so disappointing. And I'm sure George himself is disappointed. And he took that self-imposed hiatus from the Podcast P
He
production.
did.
So we saw that recently. So I mean, good on him for, I guess, devoting all of his time and focus to the season. I feel like it's too little too late at this point. Maybe you should have done something like that a month ago, as opposed to when they're 2.5 games out of 10th and 58 games in. But hey, I mean, that's good for him. He has that level of focus. So we'll have to see what the next couple of years bring. Hopefully, if he's 100%, he doesn't have this finger issue. He can inch back closer to the level of play we've seen before. Yeah, I think overall it's kind of like one of those situations to where, I mean, I would too assign him if I was in that position this past summer. Of course, now it's easy to say it was a mistake, but when you have Embiid and you have Maxey and you see a guy like George available, it's like, hey, let's bring him in. We may have to pay him the max, 35% of the cap, but if it gives us a shot at a championship, we have to take it. It's the same thing the Clippers did when they brought him in all those years ago and sent out Shea. It's like, hey, we see an opportunity to pair him with Kawhi and be a contender. Yeah, there's risk involved, but when you see a window, you have to take it because they don't come around very often. So no, I don't blame them at all for making this move. It's just kind of fortunate how it's all broken down for them, at least to this point. So for the next section here, I want to focus on a couple of newer players that have been added to the Sixers roster here recently. A couple of guys that they established or they're assuming positions in the backcourt for Philadelphia and their impact. One of them has been pretty solid to this point. The other one, I feel like it's more of an incomplete. In this section, I want to start with Quentin Grimes, who is now with the Sixers, coming over in that trade for Caleb Martin coming from Dallas. And Quentin Grimes is one of those just like perfect 3-and-D type twos that you can throw on the court and know that he's going to shoot 37, 38% from three. You know he's going to contribute as far as the scoring goes. And you can place him on some of the better guards on the opposing team in the league. And that's really valuable to have. So from that perspective, I do understand the move for Philadelphia. Moving off of Caleb Martin, he himself has been banged up and he's been underwhelming. So you bring in Quentin Grimes. He's a good bit younger. He's still in his early 20s. He has a lot to contribute. And obviously, Nick Nurse has a lot of trust and faith in what he can bring to the court, playing 30 minutes a game, averaging career high in points and assists so far in just 8 games. It's a small sample, but he has been a positive contributor for this team that needs guys like him to kind of fill the gaps to where maybe Embiid's not available or Paul George doesn't look himself. They really rely on guys like Quentin Grimes to really have a positive impact. Lonnie Walker is the other player. He's only played a few games, 3 games so far, about 14 minutes a game, coming over from the Lithuanian Basketball League and the Euro League. He averaged 13 and a half over there on 40% shooting from three. So he had a good stint, and I was expecting him to come back to the NBA at some point because I do feel like he's an NBA caliber player. The impact just hasn't quite been there yet. I expect that to improve. He's only had 3 games, and I'm sure coming over from the EuroLeague in the middle of the season for this team is challenging. So I think he needs more time to kind of get settled and really bring an impact. But when it comes to those 2 newer players to the Sixers, Adam, what have been your first impressions of those guys? And do you feel like bringing in Quentin Grimes and sending out Caleb Martin was the best move for the Sixers kind of in this context?
Yeah, so I'll start with Quentin. I did like the trade. I think generally you could make a case either way for which one of those guys is better right now between Quentin Grimes and Caleb Martin. I lean Quentin Grimes because I just have much more faith in his shooting, which I mean is sort of a no brainer, but that just is more significant to me when it comes to a role player of that ilk. Uh, when they're in the same sort of range as far as overall value, and one of them is 29 and one of them is 24. I think it just makes sense to take the 24-year-old, especially because the Sixers also got their own second round pick back in that trade. And that now is looking like a top, 38 pick or so at worst. And especially if they don't end up keeping their protected first round pick, having just any avenue to add a young player in the draft would be really nice. I've been impressed with what I've seen from him. He hasn't shot the ball particularly well from 3-point range either. I mean, he's at 36%, which is certainly not bad, but he was right at 40%, right? I think just a tick below 40% with Dallas this year. What's really stood out to me, I feel like people know at this point with Grimes, solid defender, can guard, can defend guards, maybe some smaller wings, can knock down open shots. Very willing 3-point shooter, which to me is arguably just as important as accurate 3-point shooter.
Yep.
He's shown way more on the ball stuff than I expected. Just looking at just scanning through as many numbers as I could find when the trade went down, I was impressed with the pull-up shooting numbers. I did not expect at any point for him to be given a chance to play backup point guard minutes, which happened really quickly. And Nick Nurse has been going with it. I asked Nick about it before the Knicks game, and he said, understandably mixed results. A guy on a new team who doesn't have a ton of point guard reps in the NBA, trying to figure out on the fly how to make it work. You're bound to have some, sort of a mixed bag. But they've liked what they've seen enough that they want to keep trying it. I think something that's, when we talk about how this season, it might be a lost season for them in terms of wins and losses, the next 7 weeks have to be about something. And I think one of those things is before Quentin Grimes hits restricted free agency, as they try to figure out what sort of, what they would be willing to offer him, what offer sheets they might match if there are other teams interested. I think something that is really interesting to observe is if he proves that, being a secondary ball handler is something that he can do long term, because that might change their outlook on him or another team's outlook on him. Everybody's watching these games. There might be a team that says, whoa, there's some on-ball upside that we didn't know existed here, and we might value this guy more. So that's what I would be watching for with him. I think the Sixers have been impressed, and I think they had quite a bit of conviction when you trade Caleb Martin, who, as you said, has been banged up all year, has not played well at all. It was a disappointing signing to date. But that was a 4-year contract at a really nice number. I think it was roughly, maybe 435 with incentives that could take it up a little bit. Now there's a trade kicker in there that bumped it up a tiny bit. Trading a guy that has established that he can be a valuable role player for contending teams year after year on a long-term, cost-effective deal, you really do need to have conviction that the guy you're getting can slot into a similar sort of significance in terms of role, even if not the same actual basketball role.
Yep.
And he just offers so much more offensive utility than Caleb Martin did, who to his credit played much of the season through several injuries, sometimes multiple injuries at once. And that's just sort of how he's always been. And it's a testament to the significance of the hip thing that has still kept him out, that he's been out for as long as he's been. I'm quite intrigued by Grimes. I think they had confidence when they made that trade that he was someone that they are, have a good feeling they'll be able to bring back next year. That there's not going to be a situation where someone gives him an offer sheet that they don't feel comfortable matching. As you said, he's sort of the kind of guy that slots in perfectly on any team. It's like the ultimate sort of portable role player. Like if you drop Quentin Grimes on 29 other rosters in the NBA, he would make sense within the context of those teams. Those are always good players to have, not just for yourself, but for the future if you need to make an upgrade, and that's a valuable piece that you have. But the on-ball stuff has been the most intriguing to me because it's not something I saw coming at all. I could have seen a little bit of, attacking closeouts, occasional end of shot clock pull-up jumpers. Full-fledged backup point guard minutes was not anything I expected from him. And if he can get settled in that role where he's sort of starts at the 2 next to Maxey, he checks out, he comes back in when Maxey's out, and all of a sudden he's running the show. Mm-hmm. If he can get comfortable there, it becomes a really interesting part of their future. They do have Jared McCain coming back next year, and I would imagine that he'll have the ball in his hands more than anyone other than Maxey on the perimeter moving forward. But you can never have enough ball handlers, and Nick Nurse in particular really subscribes to that belief. He loves stacking lineups with as many ball handlers as he can. Before the trade deadline, he was every night going to a lineup with Tyrese Maxey, Kyle Lowry, and Reggie Jackson, and it was just, we're stacking the lineup with ball handlers. We're going to a zone defense with Kyle Lowry at the back end, commanding everything. It worked to varying degrees. Sometimes they got their doors blown off. Sometimes it actually swung games for them. But anytime someone is comfortable, like grabbing a rebound, pushing in transition, making a pass, or just bringing the ball up, keeping the team organized, getting them into a set or an action, Nurse is just far more likely to believe in that sort of guy. So I think it's an interesting sort of experiment they're going through right now with him. On Lonnie Walker, my expectations weren't high just because first of all, it's a difficult transition to, at the drop of a dime, fly from Lithuania to Philly
Yeah,
and, join a team that has, largely been together all year and their newer guys, the other newer guys are maybe more prioritized than him, like Grimes, who they know is part of their future. There's no risk to signing to a guy to a prorated minimum and throwing a team option on it for next year and seeing if he sticks. His minutes haven't been good so far. He just hasn't shot the ball well. But if 5 of the shots that missed went in, people might be more excited right now. Again, that's part of what these next 7 weeks are going to be about. They got to give guys like Lonnie Walker, like Jared Butler, even Ricky Council, who they're familiar with, but still has some work to do. Give those guys more opportunities to learn. Rookie center Adembona, I think, is a perfect example of this. A guy with great tools who just has to get used to NBA speed, NBA physicality, know when to stay down, not get into foul trouble. If playing him for 7 weeks to finish the season allows him to come into training camp next year as a sophomore, having a better idea of what he needs to do to stay on the floor and have his coaches trust him, that's a huge win for them.
absolutely.
And so, did anyone expect that in February we would be talking about things like this as what the Sixers should be aiming for the rest
No
of the
way.
season? Certainly not. It's disastrous that this is what it's come to, but this is just what it is now, and they can't really spend too much time sulking about what it should have been because this is the reality of their season, and we're likely looking at a lot of minutes for guys who are trying to prove that they can stick in the NBA, whether that's here or even elsewhere.
Exactly. And I want to kind of follow up on a player that you just spoke about, Ricky Council, for this team. He's in a sophomore season. And yeah, I mean, he's getting plenty of opportunities to show what he can do. He's played in 50 games already, he's started 4 games. So obviously, he has some type of a role with this team. And the Sixers are somewhat optimistic about his future with the team. So, look at his tools, a 6'6" guy who shifts between the 2 and the 3. At times can be a dynamic player. And I remember seeing him a few games this season. He really kind of popped to me as a guy that can really just kind of give you a little bit of a punch there from the backcourt. Shooting 50% from 2 and 29% from 3. So not exactly a guy that's super efficient right now, but you can see the tools and you can see the outline of a good player there that they can really kind of trust to, give them some good minutes going forward. So, I would expect his minutes to continue. He's getting about the same amount of playing time right now as Lonnie Walker. So, in terms of priority, they seem to be about the same level, getting about 14 minutes a game. So, that's somebody that I'm excited to kind of see moving forward with this team. Watched him in a couple of summer leagues and kind of the same thing. It's like, he has flashes of real potential there. He just kind of has to put it all together, be more efficient, and pick his spots a little bit better going forward. I think that would really kind of solidify his future with the team. And then a player that I wasn't expecting to see so much of this season, I think in part has been due to the whole Paul George situation, is Justin Edwards there on the wing for Philadelphia. A 6'6" forward, similar size to Rookie Council, but he plays more that wing position. A rookie out of Kentucky. He's playing about 24 minutes a game. So he's getting some good run right now. And he's started 9 games so far for the Sixers. So he seems to be that next guy in line that, if Paul George isn't available, Paul George is not in the game for whatever reason, bring in Justin Edwards, and he can give you a little bit of production there from the 3. So again, for him, it's, from the 2, he's at about 29%, but from 3, in the 30s here. So you're getting a little bit of production there from deep from Justin Edwards that even at times with Paul George, you're not getting. So I think that's part of the reason why he's getting some good run here. He's had some good moments. And I would expect that to continue as the season progresses and going into next season. Another guy they can be excited about and maybe give more minutes to, more priority as we get into next season and beyond there. So those 2 players, have been good, and I expect to see more of them going forward. But some of your impressions from some of these younger guys, because like you said, they have more priority now that the season is kind of down the drain for the Sixers, and they need to shift their attention to something a little bit more different, which is going to be their future in terms of who they can trust to give more minutes to going forward.
Yeah, so with Ricky and Justin, there are some similar parallels, and then there are also some sort of key differences that show why like one is sort of has their stock rising right now and the other doesn't. So I'll start with Ricky. So as you said before, when you catch him on the right night, he really pops because
Oh yeah,
just a remarkable athlete, like 95th percentile plus sort of athlete.
big
There are
time.
some really interesting statistical trends with him, particularly getting fouled. He can get downhill because he's so powerful and athletic that he can get to the rim. He's not a great finisher, but he's so strong going towards the rim that he often can at least get a whistle. So that those are sort of the pros with him. The shooting mechanics are just never going to look good, and they don't always need to look good to go in. The shot hasn't really fallen this year. It did in a small sample last year. He also shot pretty well on higher volume in the G League from three last year, but it just hasn't been the same this year. Last year, he was like Edwards started this year. He was a rookie, undrafted free agent on a two-way, and he worked his way up and earned a conversion to a standard deal. He wasn't a regular rotation guy by the time the playoffs came around, but really helped bridge the gap to that point, especially when Embiid was out for those couple months with the meniscus injury later in the season. He really sort of stepped into a bigger role as sort of an energy guy. And that's sort of what Nurse has asked him to do this year is like, I mean, there have been so many games where they just come out flat and they go down and Ricky might not be in the rotation initially, and Nick just throws him in there, and it's like hopefully Ricky gives us a spark, and he's the caliber of player, like the sort of archetype of player I should say that can do that, and he did that a handful of times as a rookie. The spark just hasn't been there this year really with him. I think there's some. I just think he's struggled to earn the trust of the coaches entirely that on both ends of the floor that he is going to execute exactly what they need him to do, and that's stuff that's certainly correctable. I don't think it's ever stemmed from a lack of effort. I think Ricky's a guy who tries very hard, and I think that's part of why there are a lot of Sixers fans who really enjoy watching him play. So if it works out, it's a really interesting and unique player because it's this like interesting blend of power and speed, and it's someone who you don't think of as a scorer, but you can at the end of a shot clock put the ball in his hands, and he's just going to put his head down fearlessly and go to the rim, and will draw fouls a lot more often than most guys would. And it's sort of an interesting skill to bank on, and some would say maybe not advisable to bank on that skill. I think the biggest thing, and I mean, to be fair, you could say this for the vast majority of young role players in the NBA, is just being more reliable as a spot up 3-point shooter. It always helps. His form is just a little bizarre, and he's oddly reliant on like step back threes that don't go in very often. He somehow is like the best end of clock shooter ever. I think like I can think of like 5 different times that he's hit a buzzer beating three to end a quarter, and none of them are good shots, but they all go in. Maybe he's the new Peyton Pritchard somehow. I don't know how that could even be. Um,
Right.
but I think the biggest key for Ricky is just continuing to earn the trust of the coaches. There's no doubt the ability is there, the athleticism is there, even if he's not someone that is necessarily going to ever be a starter for a high level team. He certainly has the tools to be a helpful piece for one. And frankly, he was one at times last year as a rookie who for most of the season was on a two-way. I think it's just about him finding the right role for himself on both ends of the floor, not doing too much, sometimes taking a step back and realizing, okay, when I'm on the floor with Tyrese Maxey and Paul George, for example, I should probably be spacing. And if I can attack a closeout, that's great, but it's probably not the right possession for me to take 6 dribbles. And I say that because that leads me into Justin Edwards, who I think has done a lot of stuff really well on the court in terms of, sort of tangible skills. But I think his strongest trait right now is his feel for the game and just understanding of when it's a time to be assertive versus when it's a time to take a step back. And sometimes you're playing with great players, you just got to get out of the way. And I think Justin's understanding of that is really strong. And I think the unique blend that he has is he knows his place on the floor offensively. He knows how to stay out of the way of other guys, but he also understands that if he catches the ball behind the 3-point line with even a little bit of room, they want him having a quick trigger on threes. And that's another, like I mentioned earlier, with someone that sometimes your volume and your willingness to shoot from three is just as important as your accuracy. And I think
Yep.
that's the case for him, because if you can repeatedly demonstrate that you're going to catch and fire away immediately, and you can do it at even modest efficiency, like teams are going to guard you more aggressively at the 3-point line than if your 3-point percentage is 2 points higher on 2 fewer attempts per game, for example. So I've been incredibly impressed by Edwards, and it's someone that I'm like pretty comfortable saying moving forward is a rotation piece for them. He had started, I think, 8 or 9 games in a row leading up to Quentin Grimes ultimately getting inserted into the lineup, and he's just a different caliber of shooter. That's a guy that's high volume and higher efficiency
Yep.
than Edwards is, and it's understandable. And there's no shame in being basically the most high usage in terms of minutes bench player on a team as a guy who was on a 2-way contract a month ago. He earned every bit of the standard contract he got. They didn't have any exceptions remaining because they gave the entirety of their room mid-level to Kelly Oubre over the summer. So they could only do a 2-year minimum. They threw a team option on it. My strong inclination is to say they're going to decline that so that they can sign him to a longer-term deal using whatever cap exceptions they end up having this summer. Just something they could also do with they did that structure with him. They did it with Jared Butler. They did it with Walker, guys that they can
Yep.
decline it and bring them back on a longer term deal if those guys prove they're worth a long term deal. I think Edwards already has. I actually think in some ways the like trials and tribulations that the coaching staff has had with Ricky Council has improved their sort of internal view of Edwards, because they appreciate like, oh, this is another like guy with great size on the wing who theoretically should fit in well, and he's just doing what we're asking him to do to a T, nothing more, nothing less. Because I don't think it's that Ricky's incapable of doing the stuff they're asking him to. I think sometimes he just tries to do too much. And I think Edwards right now has a better understanding of what he needs to do to impact winning and to prove to the team that he can do that consistently. And I think he already has, and it'll be interesting to see, does he get more reps as an on-ball guy offensively over the next several weeks, just to see what it looks like. I'd be interested in seeing what that does look like. I don't think there's much upside there, but it's worth looking at. Defensively is really where he stands out, just because sort of the positional spectrum that he can defend. I mean, just off the top of my head, and he's been in the rotation for, since early January maybe, and he's guarded Jalen Brunson twice in crunch time. He's guarded SGA for an entire game. He's guarded Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. They're like, it's a Paolo Banchero in crunch time, I believe, in Orlando. It's a wide spectrum, like stylistically, positionally, size wise, and he holds his own. I come back to the feel, because there's like a great frame. There's good body, good athleticism. Like he's certainly not Ricky's caliber of athlete, but he's a good athlete. He moves his feet certainly well enough. But it's putting all of that together by also having a really good understanding on both ends of the floor of what he needs to do. He's become a good rebounder for them as well, which anytime a wing can rebound, Nick Nurse is over the moon, and that's something that he's talked about with Ricky. And there are flashes of it, because again, an athlete like Ricky can do that, and he has. Remember, I think they were playing the Rockets. He had a double double off the bench, and they lost that game, but Nick was still just raving about, like, that is exactly what we need Ricky Council to do. I think Edwards just already in a smaller sample size been more sort of actualized of what this guy looks like in the context of an NBA team on a nightly basis. And I think they're comfortable moving forward, sort of banking on him, not necessarily as a starter right now, but this is a guy who's going to be in our rotation every night, who's a wing that can defend like let's call it 1.5 through 4, and will happily take open spot up threes and make them at a decent enough clip. And most importantly, arguably, like stay out of the way when guys like Maxey and if Embiid is playing and George is playing, stay out of those guys' way. So I think that's sort of the long version of the outlook on those two. I definitely think this season Edwards is probably major stock up, and Ricky, his stock, I would say, has taken a hit. I would not say it's at the ground floor. He's also on a contract that, if he's even the slightest bit helpful, it's hugely valuable to have a guy who's making basically 1% of the cap, non-guaranteed on your roster. That stuff helps quite a bit. So that's sort of the outlook on them, and I would expect that Edwards will have his team option declined in June, and they'll do that so that they can bring him back on a longer-term deal that sort of cements him as part of their future.
Funny you bring up the future, Adam, because that's where I feel like the next logical step in this process here is for the Sixers. And to kind of help break down what their future looks like, I am going to share my screen. I have a few different tabs pulled up right now. So I'm going to start with the salary cap for the Sixers. These are some
Perfect.
numbers that we've brought up here. You've brought up some of these already during this pod. I brought up a few. So it kind of helps put things in perspective as far as like what's on the books for the Sixers and what they're going to be dealing with as the years go on. So we can see the top earners. We've talked about them at length already. Embiid and Paul George up at the 50 million mark. They're at about 35% of the cap. They're the monster earners, 100 million between the two of them. And then as we kind of scroll down, you can see some of those other contributors there. Quentin Grimes, and then you mentioned the restricted free agency that he's sitting into this summer. So that's going to be a pretty nice raise for him. I would expect him to be over 10 million a season or so once he gets that new contract on in the books starting in 25-26. And then we just talked about some of the younger guys, Justin Edwards, rookie council. So you can see that they have pretty minuscule cap holds here for the next couple of seasons. And then as we scroll down here, you can see what they're dealing with in terms of salary cap space and tax space. So, not the worst situation right now, but they are going to have to be mindful of, how they use exceptions. You mentioned that earlier, and, who they bring on to kind of help support the bigger earners. And then what the new contract looks like for Quentin Grimes is also going to be a really big question there. So, yeah, it's definitely a different cap situation next summer as opposed to this past summer where they had, all this cap space. They had the room exception. Like you mentioned, Asai Kelly Oubre, like that's pretty much all up the window now because they have some other contracts on the books here, some other guys they're going to have to look out for. And then obviously when it comes to the contracts for next season, there is another possible contract that's going to be added in, and it's going to be if they keep their pick, a top 6 pick in the 2025 draft, and that's going to command several more $1 million, if they do keep that. So that brings me to another page that I want to show everybody, and this is the draft capital situation for Philadelphia. So you mentioned these picks already. Philadelphia has their own pick here. Obviously, theirs is the more favorable of theirs in Denver's. So they're going to have their own there. And then Philadelphia's own pick is top 6 protected. It moves into top 4 if it doesn't convey this year. That is owed to OKC, which I want to point this out. It just seems like when you go through the lottery process for all these different teams, OKC is everywhere. Like
everyone's pick goes to OKC. It is unbelievable.
It's crazy, man. They're at the top of the league, but all these teams owe picks to OKC. I mean, they're just sneaking in there. They're like,
incredible.
We're going to have the best record in the league, but you owe us a pick and you owe us a pick. Like it's just it blows my mind. I just wanted to point that out.
It's wild.
It really is, man. I can't believe it. I mean, their front office is second to none. Just incredible work.
Yeah, I also believe their second round pick that they got back from Dallas. They also originally traded to OKC, and then it got rerouted a few times and ended up with Dallas and then back to the Sixers. And that was for George Hill at many trade deadlines ago. And this pick that we're talking about now, Yeah, and this pick we're talking about now was what it cost them to get out off of Al Horford after that one disastrous year
Yep,
where he looked like a guy who, we talk about cooked. That was a guy who looked like he was cooked, and
he
then had a
did.
year in OKC where he barely played. What goes back to Boston and is the exact same guy he was before, wins a title, and Sixers fans will never quite get over the Al Horford trajectory there. It's really
Yeah,
unbelievable.
absolutely, man. I'm glad you brought him up. That was a crazy scenario for Philadelphia not that long ago. But now it looks like their draft capital situation, it's looking better. It's, a little bit lacking the next couple of years. But you move out to 27 and beyond. I mean, they have a lot to work with here. Clippers first rounder in a few years. They have the more favorable Phoenix Golden State, another Golden State second. So, I mean, they're doing pretty good out in the future here. But I want to keep the focus on 25 because that is what they're focused on right now. And this is a really important draft for them. If they keep that first rounder, I mean, there's a lot of great names at the top. And I mean, don't want to, get ahead of myself here, but I mean, there's a guy named Cooper Fly waiting in the wings and
Yes, there is.
guys of that caliber. So, I mean, between him, Dylan Harper, there is a chance they move up. So, I mean, I want to kind of highlight another page that I have up right now. When we're talking about the Sixers draft odds, and it's going to be Tankathon. And yeah, I'm a Miami Heat guy, Adam. So I am not typically used to checking this page as often as I am right now. So I mean, but I have found myself frequenting this page a lot more here in the past few weeks. To keep the focus on the Sixers, you can see them here at 6. I mean, they're just inside that top 6 right now. So I mean, this would be the perfect time to shut Embiid down and to make sure they stay in this mix of top 6 so they can keep that pick. As it stands right now, I mean, 9% chance of first overall, 37% at top 4. I mean, pretty decent here. And you can see their streak in their last 10 games. I think it's funny how in this situation, the more you lose, you
It's
see the
green,
green.
right?
So it's like you're doing a
Yeah,
great job. Like whatever you're doing, just keep it up. Like just get those odds
yeah,
up. So I found that
yeah.
kind of moving as well.
First of all, I just want to say real quick is that it's funny you bring up Tankathon, which is the absolute best resource for all this stuff. And I just a few hours ago was talking with Matt from Tankathon for a story that you might be on the lookout for in the next handful of days. But yeah, it's really crazy that we got here. It never even occurred to me once during the offseason. I spend the summer thinking about every possible scenario that could happen with the Sixers. Never once did I really think that like we would have serious conversations about what they would have to do to keep this top 6 protected pick. Um, but but that's where we are now, and I've written about this a handful of times now, and now I'm doing a series on Wednesdays called Tank Watch, and the first one came out yesterday, and it's just sort of looking at the week ahead for the Sixers and the teams close to them in the lottery standings. And right now, I'm focused on Brooklyn right below them and Toronto right above them. So I basically just broke down the odds of them keeping their pick based on each slot. I know Tankathon has a pick odds tab that you can go to, and I basically just added up the percentages from there. So right now they're in the 6th spot. It's like almost a coin flip. It's about a 46% chance that they keep their pick, which is not, obviously it's less likely than not, but you at least have a shot at it. It basically means you can't have anybody jump you or you have to jump yourself.
Right.
Um, but if they end up behind Brooklyn and they're in the 7th spot, then you're looking at about a 32% chance, which, you have a fighter shot. You got to jump into the top 4, but it's an uphill battle. If
Yep.
you're in the 5th spot, where Toronto is right now, and if you can also look at Tankathon's strength of schedule, the Raptors have, I think, 4 games left against teams above 500 all season. Their remaining strength of schedule was like below 40%, which I don't think I've ever seen it with this many games left in the year. If they can get into that 5 spot, it jumps up from about a 45% chance of keeping the pick to roughly 64%. Because if you're in the 5th spot, you would need 2 teams to jump you in order to fall to number 7 or below.
Right.
So that will be difficult because Toronto knows this too, and they have every reason to shut guys down. But they've also had a sort of bizarre Uh, confusing maybe is a better word, like understanding of what direction they're in, where based on the level of talent on their roster and their record, you would expect them to go into the tank the last few weeks of the season. But they traded a first round pick to get Brandon Ingram, who's supposedly going to play at some point over the next, several weeks. They've been playing better seemingly with some of their, with, Emmanuel quickly missed a bunch of time. He's now back. They've had some other guys come back. So the Sixers and Raptors play two more games this year, and those might be the two biggest games of the year for the Sixers, because if they lose both of those, they are within like real striking distance of getting into that fifth spot in the lottery. And then you go from a little bit less than a 50% chance to almost a 2/3 chance of keeping your pick. And there are some salary cap ramifications of that. Like Kelly Oubre could be the casualty there. Even Gershon Yabusele, who they resisted trading at the deadline because they hope to keep him, he could be a casualty there. I would imagine it wouldn't be Grimes, but that's a good problem to have. Ultimately, they would, of
For
course,
sure.
if you can salvage this season to any degree by, of course, Cooper Flag would be quite a way to cap off this year and arguably make it worth it to some degree.
For
But
sure.
even if they land the fifth or sixth pick or the fourth pick, even they jump into the top four, but not all the way up. Just having more infusion of young talent would be really nice, not just for right now where you have these guys on max contracts and you need cost controlled talent, though the rookie scale is not maybe as tiny as it used to be. I just think it's, you do have to start thinking about a post Embiid, even post George future, even though Embiid's got 4 years left after this one and George has 3. With the trajectory that Joel is on right now, you just, it would be silly to have the same level of confidence right now in how Joel will look in 2028, 2029, for example, than you would have thought 2 years ago, where, yeah, he's not playing 82 games, but like he's avoided catastrophic injuries for a long time now. He's mostly in the 60 to 65 range. Like that, you can easily work with that. They have other players who can help shoulder the load. He, had gotten into a really good place physically. Now that that's not the case, you do have to start thinking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now. That's part of what these organizations have to keep in mind and be cognizant of. And certainly, I mean, I'm now playing catch up on a lot of these draft prospects, but just from hearing the way people talk about, the loaded sort of nature of this class, would be really really helpful to some extent salvage what has been just the most disastrous season they could have imagined by at least having the opportunity to get some 18, 19, 20-year-old who can maybe help them right away. But more importantly, when you look 5 years down the line, can be one of the cornerstones of the franchise alongside guys like Maxey, who's still only 24, Jared McCain, who just turned 21 last week, even someone like Grimes, who's 24, Edwards is 21. Like this is not completely rudderless long
Right.
term, even despite the bad contracts, because they've been drafting very well. I mean, to hit on Maxey at number 21 overall in 2020 and McCain at 16 overall, and have those guys show what they've shown. Even McCain in I think 23 games clearly has way more upside than people realize, particularly as an on-ball player, and that is another thing that sort of they have to recalibrate how they envision the team. Getting this pick back would be so significant, not just for like the long-term health of the organization, but even just for the way that they're viewed and discussed locally right now. Uh, I don't think anything other than Cooper Flag would really convince anyone that like, all right, the Sixers are back, the Sixers are in a good spot again. But just the extent of like the hellish nature of the season, where so many people have checked out, and everyone would rather just sit in the arena and do an Eagles chant and think about Saquon in the Super Bowl than like who's on the court for the Sixers. And even like Philly season is starting. People are just, and I understand it, or a lot of people are largely checked out on the Sixers at this point, and it's going
Yep.
to take a lot to get people back in. So whether it's Cooper Flag or one of the guys from Rutgers, or even just a guy at 5 or 6 who's exciting, it would in more ways than one be really helpful for the long term for them if they can get this pick, even if that means they have to do this all over again next year. And I think the protection maybe goes to 1 to 4 next year to OKC. Like that pick is almost certainly going to convey at some point. And they do also owe a pick to Brooklyn still from the Ben Simmons James Harden trade that would get pushed back a year. But
Yep.
that's stuff that they would happily live with if they can get that sort of serious infusion of young talent.
Oh yeah, I mean this is huge for them, and yeah, to kind of like top it off, I think you mentioned this before, but I mean, yeah, Philly is definitely towards the bottom in terms of strength of schedule left. But I mean, Toronto directly in front of them, and they're at the bottom, literally the lowest
Yeah.
remaining win percentage here at 30. So I mean, that's definitely a positive for the Sixers. And yeah, Adam, I think I agree with all your points there on the future of the Sixers. And this is going to be a huge last few weeks, even though, like you said, a majority of the fan base is checked out. And I'm seeing the jokes fly around, like for instance, we sacrificed the Sixers for the Eagles and things like that.
Right.
Regardless of all that, I mean, it's still going to be a very important few weeks. I mean, I boiled it down to 3 primary goals for the Sixers to end the season. Look forward to the lottery, prepare for the lottery if you do keep that pick, develop the younger pieces, like guys like Justin Edwards we talked about earlier, and then just get Embiid and PG healthy. Have these guys be 100%, whether that's this season, next season, most likely next season until they get 100%. But just make sure those guys are ready to go for that campaign. I mean, that's the gist of it for the Sixers, and that's what they need to prioritize as the season winds down here. So yeah, I think that about caps it off. Adam, I know there's a lot of information for those of you that may be listening or watching this pod, but we hope that all this information is helpful to you and you get a better understanding of where the Sixers are at and where they're going in the future. So thanks again, Adam, for joining this pod. This has been a really great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Before I let you go, I just want to give you an opportunity to plug socials, where you do your work at, things like that. Where can the people find you if they want to check out some of your work?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you again for having me. It's been great. You can find me on Twitter at Sixers Adam, Blue Sky at Adam Aaronson, 2 A's in Aaronson. My writing is at phillyvoice.com. Everything that I write, I post on those socials, so you'll be able to find it there. Every Sixers game, for whatever meaning I can extract from them, I'll have everything from features on different guys to the tank watch stories that I just referenced, which I'm expecting to do many of between now and May. Everything I pride myself on, as comprehensive coverage of the Sixers as I can offer. So yeah, anyone who wants to check it out, I would very much appreciate.
Oh, that's awesome, Adam. And I encourage everybody to check it out because he does do great work. Whether you're checking him out on Twitter or the website, check out his articles. I highly encourage you to do so because it is high quality stuff. If you guys are looking for more content from us, we're going to be at notradeclause.com, over on Twitter X at notrade_clause, and then on Instagram at noTradeClause, all one word. So we hope that you will check out some of our socials to see what we have coming up through the pipeline as the season continues. So thanks again, everybody, for sticking with us. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we really hope to catch you on the next installment of NTC. But until then, take care, everybody.